Welcome to Heart with Anna, featuring your host, Anna Jaworski. Our program is a program designed to empower the CHD or congenital heart defect community. Our program may also help families who have children who are chronically ill by bringing information and encouragement to you in order to become an advocate for your community. Now, here is Anna Jaworski.
Welcome to Heart with Anna. I am Anna Jaworski and the host of Heart with Anna. We are in Season 8 of Heart with Anna. Our theme this season is care for adults with congenital heart defects, and our show today is adult survivors with neurological problems. Our guest is Heart Mom Kathy Keller. Kathy Keller is mom to Garrett, aged 19, whose congenital heart defect journey has been complex. He was born with hypoplastic-left-heart syndrome, or HLHS, and due to Fontan complications, had a major stroke, leaving him cognitively impaired with minimal use of his right arm. At 13, Garrett developed plastic bronchitis and was listed for a heart transplant. He was fortunate to receive the gift of a new heart when he was 14. Unfortunately, his transplant was complex, and he had another stroke. The second stroke left him with post-pump chorea, a rare movement disorder, and dysarthria, a neurological speech impairment. In spite of all this, Garrett has done amazingly well, but due to the severity of his brain injuries, will require lifetime support. At age 18, Kathy and Dennis obtained full guardianship and will continue working to ensure Garrett's financial future utilizing special needs financial planning. Garrett's new heart is doing great, and Kathy and Dennis are grateful for the opportunity to plan for his future. So welcome to Heart with Anna, Kathy.
Hi, happy to be here, Anna.
Well, first of all, let me actually say welcome back. Many of our longtime listeners may remember you. You came on in Season 1. It's hard for me to believe it was that long ago. But you were on the show with Eileen Perlman, Jessica Cohen, Emily Weibke, and Anthony Pugliese talking about organ donation and transplantation. So I'm so excited to have you back on the show this time. And this time, instead of sharing the show with a bunch of other guests, we have it just to ourselves.
Well, that was a great experience, and I actually learned a lot from the other guests as well, but I believe we can fill this full half hour for sure.
I think we can, Kathy. So I'm thrilled to see that Garrett has made it to adulthood, but it certainly has been a rough road for him. So in your intro, we talked a little bit about his journey, but I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about what happened after he had his Fontan and suffered his stroke.
Well, when Garrett had his Fontan, it was a lot of years ago. He's 19 now. And at the time, they were actually doing Fontans a little younger. So he was 18 months when he had his. They don't do them that young very often anymore, partially because of the stuff that happened to Garrett. He's always been a pioneer and ahead of his time. So after his Fontan, he had terrible pleural effusions. They seemed to get it under control and sent him home to Virginia. Unfortunately, they redeveloped and he was rehospitalized. And then we really don't know what caused the clot, but one night his face started twitching on one side, and the doctor there kind of chalked it up to anesthesia withdrawal, but that night he had a massive seizure. After that, things went downhill really fast. They had told us it had taken out a pretty significant part of his brain. On top of it, the effusions decided to become the Great Flood and went into his abdomen. He got peritonitis, and they were pretty much sure that if we did not lose him, that he would certainly not be able to talk or walk, given the amount of damage they saw on the MRI. So there's really nothing to be done but wait and see. So that's what we did. And he did get out of the hospital. So
I know. And we have lovely photos of him standing with your family.
Yes,
so I'm
and he does talk.
That he's also walking. Yeah.
Yeah, he walks. He walks with a funny gait, but he walks. He walks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow, which just shows how a baby's brain, I mean, at 18 months, to me, he's still a baby, but a very young child, how malleable they are and how they are able to come back much more so than was predicted.
Absolutely. And it's neuroplasticity, right? And neuroplasticity is kids' brains definitely come back, but adult brains can too. So I don't want it to be like, adults can work hard and you're never going to get it all back. But neuroplasticity is like a double-edged sword because they definitely come back. But we hung our hat on that for a long time, and Garrett's came back way more than they thought, but didn't come back totally. I think I thought it was going to come back totally for a long time until I got my head around that it wasn't.
Yeah.
But it came back more than they thought, that's for sure.
Right. Well, so then he had another stroke after his transplant. Tell us about that.
He did. And what happened there is he had a difficult transplant, and when he went on bypass, they've since learned this too, by the way, from Garrett. So when you put a neurologically impaired person on bypass, the risk is higher for them to have a neurological incident. So the bypass machines have actually progressed where they don't have to cool so much anymore. When you go on bypass, they cool you down. So that cooling for Garrett was harder than for somebody who doesn't have the neurological. So what happened there is we didn't really see it until he started coming out of the anesthesia, and he really started uncontrollably moving. I mean, he just could not stop moving, and that created an issue because he was just out of heart surgery. We actually reopened his sutures in his chest, so they had to take him down, basically steel plate his chest closed. That was another first. They'd never done that before. And then they kept him under for 8 weeks because not really because he needed to be under, but because he needed to heal. They needed the bones to grow, and they knew if they brought him to, he might move again. So we had to wait 8 weeks to kind of see what the damage was the second time.
So he was like in a medically induced coma for 8 weeks? Is that what that's like? Wow, Kathy. That must have been terrifying for you and Dennis.
It was scary, and they trached him. They put him on a trach, so he became trach dependent and feeding tube dependent during that time. It was a very slow process because they had to wake him up, and then there's certain things that were just impaired because he was in induced coma for 8 weeks. Like he couldn't walk when he came to, but that's very typical of someone who was in an induced coma. So we didn't know whether it was because of the second stroke or because of the induced bedtime. It kind of revealed itself very slowly. What came out of that that's kind of left is dysarthria. So he slurs his speech, and then he has still the post-pump chorea. So he does move a lot. It's a very violent kind of movement that he does probably 4 or 5 times a day. Just depends on the day.
So is that like kind of like cerebral palsy where they have uncontrollable movements?
Yeah, it is. And actually, Garrett, when you see him, looks a lot like a cognitively impaired kid with cerebral palsy who has autism. That's what he looks like the vocalizations. And actually, sometimes I tell people that's what he has because it's easier.
Just to make it easier?
Yes.
Well, I mean, this is so complicated. I can see where it would be very difficult to explain. And really, the only people who really need to know exactly what's going on are his therapists, his teachers, his doctors, and the rest of the world, they don't really need to know.
That's true. And honestly, the treatments are very similar. It doesn't really change anything how he got to where he is.
Right. But it's really important for the heart world to know because Garrett's probably not the only one in the universe that this has happened to, even though you're the first person who's come on the radio show who is talking about this, Kathy. See, another first for Garrett.
Another first for Garrett. Well, the thing about Garrett's neurological issues is they're complicated, but kids who have congenital heart disease and surgeries, there's a whole range of neurological complications. And I was thinking this morning, I was like, he's not the most complicated, honestly. He is very complicated, but like you said, he can walk and talk. So there's kids who can't, so he's not like the worst, right? But there's a lot of kids who end up with simpler neurological things like learning disabilities. I don't mean to say they're simple, but you know what I mean. But they have things that are a direct result of the low oxygenation levels that I think just now people are starting to pay attention to them. So it does apply to probably more than we think.
Probably so. But we need to take a quick commercial break. But don't leave yet because we're going to talk to Kathy about the different therapies that Garrett has had as a young child and how he has progressed. We'll be right back after this brief break.
Anna Jaworski has written several books to empower the congenital heart defect or CHD community. These books can be found at Amazon.com or at her website, www.babyheartspress.com. Her bestseller is The Heart of a Mother, an anthology of stories written by women for women in the CHD community. Anna's other books, My Brother Needs an Operation, The Heart of a Father, and Hypoplastic-Left-Heart Syndrome, a handbook for parents, will help you understand that you are not alone. Visit babyheartspress.com to find out more.
Welcome back to our show, Heart to Heart with Anna, a show for the congenital heart defect community. Today's show is adult survivors with neurological problems, and our guest is Heart Mom Kathy Keller. We've been talking to Kathy about her son had 2 strokes and some of the cognitive impairment and problems that Garrett has had to deal with. But now I'd like to turn my attention to the therapies he's had and how he's been doing in school. So, Kathy, we've already said that he can walk, he can talk, but let's talk about some of the therapies he's had and what kind of successes he had with those therapies.
Well, when he was little, we did a lot between the first and the second stroke. So when he was little, he came home from the hospital. He had the gamut, physical, occupational, speech therapy, because at that point he was so little, we didn't really know what the cognitive issues were going to be. So we just kind of went full bore through the early intervention programs and did everything. There were AFOs and bracing involved because as he aged, his muscles got tight, just like cerebral palsy. It's really the same thing, honestly. So he wore leg braces to help him learn to walk, and he used some equipment to help him learn to walk, but eventually he did learn to walk. He finally walked when he was about 30 months old. Two things I did want to mention is we used music therapy a lot. That really resonated with Garrett. He loved music therapy, still does. And we used medications. With cognitive issues, a lot of times he had emotional lability. He was up and down and all over the place and angry and anxious, and it just wasn't good. So we ended up going down the route of using some medication. The advice we got was to use the medication as a way to clear the fog so that he could actually learn through the behavioral techniques. We tried the behavioral techniques alone, and we're getting nowhere. So we gave medication, cleared his head, and then he was actually able to learn, and we've actually since been able to wean him off on what I call his brain meds because he does have brain injuries. So I don't call them behavior meds. I don't like that name because they don't call his heart meds. His heart meds are heart meds. His brain meds are brain meds. So he has come off most of them. Actually, almost all of them. He takes one for the movement now, but that we found actually pretty helpful and had to think hard about it. And then in school, mainstreaming didn't work. He ended up in a special needs school. That way he could get more intensive therapies, which is what he really needs. And a lot of families have this dilemma between school and therapy when they have these issues, like should I do school or do I take him up for therapy? And by putting him in the special needs school for us, it kind of got us more bang for the buck. And mainstreaming is great for many, many kids, but for Garrett, it just really wasn't the best thing.
Do you live in a big city that offers this, or has he had to travel to a different city for school?
He had to travel to a different city. We traded off. It was a 40-minute bus ride each way to get him to school. And we made that decision because the public school just honestly was not equipped, and nor would I expect them to be honest, to deal with this. Actually, as a high school, though, they are equipped now. At the time, they were not. But now he actually does not go to that school anymore. Now he goes to a self-contained unit within a regular high school, which is working great for him.
Now he's 19. When does he age out?
He ages out at 21. We are actually choosing to walk him for graduation next year, which is 1 year early. And we're doing that because if we didn't, he would graduate the same year as his younger brother. So we made that decision to do that because he needs to be ahead of his younger brother in something. And psychologically, we think it will be better for him to do that. And he's pretty much gotten what he can out of the school program. So we think it's probably time to move on.
Wow. Okay, so he will graduate a year before his brother, so he'll still be the big brother and achieving some of those milestones before younger brother. I think psychologically that makes a lot of sense and emotionally. But what's next for Garrett? What will you do with him if he's not in public school?
Well, we're starting to look at programs. We do have the option to send him back into that program as a worker, which is probably what we're going to do. They've offered us that. So he works right now. It's a great program. It's a big high school. They equip their copy center for the disabled, and they actually pay him minimum wage to go in and make copies and staple and deliver them. So he might be able to do that for 1 more year at the school, in which case we'll probably do that. And then otherwise, we're really looking at what are his possibilities. We are connected with the services of our town to look at employment opportunities. So far, nothing's come up that actually works. And I think it's the combination of the physical, the cognitive, and actually the heart stuff does play into his employment opportunities. Because of the transplant, he's immune compromised. So like working in a restaurant or working with the animal shelter is out of the question. So we're trying to find the right thing. Nothing yet, but we're working on figuring it out. And that's one of the points I actually wanted to make when you said I could come out and talk is planning early. And I think we're going to talk about planning, but planning early is everything to know what's out there and get access to it.
Right, and we're going to talk about that more in the third segment. So before we go to another quick commercial, I just wanted to ask, what is his prognosis now?
Well, his neurological prognosis is stable. So it is what it is, and we're going to try to get as much as we can. His heart prognosis, well, transplants don't last forever. They can last a really long time. He's not a candidate for a second one due to the neurological complications, which is difficult. So we'll just kind of see. We kind of go one day at a time here, and we look at progression. There's a lot going on with dealing with post-transplant rejection, with mechanical hearts. There's all kinds of stuff. So the longer that heart works, the better for us. But they say the average is 10 years, but that's an average. And Garrett's above average.
Garrett is definitely above average, and that's a great way for us to go to another commercial. When we come back, we're going to be talking to Kathy about what advice she has for other parents who have children who have congenital heart defects and also suffer from neurological impairment. And we'll also be talking about other things that parents need to consider. We'll be right back.
Anna Jaworski has spoken around the world at congenital heart defect events, and she is available as a keynote or guest speaker for your event. Go to hearttoheartwithanna.com to learn more about booking Anna for your event. You can also find out more about the radio program. Keep up to date with CHD resources and information about advocacy groups, as well as read Anna's weekly blog. Anna wants you to stay well connected and participate in the CHD community. Visit hearttoheartwithanna.com today.
Welcome back to our show, Heart to Heart with Anna, a show for the congenital heart defect community. Today's show is adult survivors with neurological problems, and our guest is heart mom Kathy Keller. And Kathy has been telling us about the kinds of problems her son Garrett encountered after suffering 2 strokes and the therapies and interventions he's had. And we even talked a little bit about his prognosis. But now I want to talk to Kathy about both Garrett's future and your and Dennis's future, Kathy. So first of all, why don't you tell us about some of the steps that you've taken to ensure that Garrett will be well taken care of as an adult, and what advice you have for other parents of children. You already alluded to the fact that we need to start planning early, so why don't you share some of that information with us?
Okay. This one's kind of a topic near and dear to my heart because I do think it's an important, and I was so in the dark for the longest time. So my first piece of advice is start planning when they're little. Start thinking about what it's going to be like as an adult when they're little. And it's hard because when they're little, you don't really know what they're going to be able to do. So it's easy to say, I'm going to get this all fixed and I'm not going to plan because it's all going to be okay. But the tact that I think people should think about is it's all going to be okay and I'm going to work as hard as I can to get as much as I can, but I'm going to plan so that things are ready. And the reason I say that is because there was one service that Garrett needs, and we waited 10 years on the waiting list for it. And it just came through this year. So we were really lucky, and this is another piece of advice, is we got hooked up with a support organization, and the one we use for Garrett's stroke issues is Brain Injury Services of Northern Virginia. I think we connected with them through the hospital. I'm really not sure, but they've assigned us a pediatric caseworker who's been guiding us in terms of access to services all along the way, and it's been incredibly helpful because she told us you need to apply for this program because it gives job supports and things that Garrett may need. And we went on the waiting list 10 years ago, and we got it 2 months before his 18th birthday.
Wow.
Yeah, and so
that's
I hear
amazing to me. A waiting list for 10 years. It really does require early planning. And do all states have
a lot of states? Not every
like
waiting list is as long as Virginia, but many are over 5 years. And I know from families who have kind of looked up in their mid-teens and said, okay, now I need to start planning, and then they run right into that wall. And we did not. So I would say plan now. It's also hard to move. Yeah. We've also planned our retirement around staying put because you get very entrenched in services. So we kind of planned forward to say we have to stay here. Even though it's an expensive area, we're planning that way. And siblings and family, if you're lucky enough to have them that are supportive, it's a big deal when you have a kid like Garrett, and we do. So
yes. Absolutely. But that's a really good point to make, Kathy, that you may not want to get a job as a parent that requires a lot of moving because once you establish those services, it's probably very difficult to reestablish them in a new location.
I think it is. I mean, I look at all the ways that Garrett gets support. Even relocating medically is difficult, right? But now you're relocating educational services, you're relocating therapists, relocating job programs, housing programs. It just becomes a lot, you know.
Yeah.
So
well, yeah,
especially
if you are on a waiting list. Yeah, and if you are on a waiting list and then you move, oh my goodness, you're on the bottom of the list again. So that's definitely something to consider. So, Kathy, I want us to talk about guardianship. Can you tell us what that is and why parents would need to think about getting guardianship over their children?
Sure. So when they turn 18, they're adults, and you lose access to pretty much everything. And with Garrett, he just didn't have the cognitive ability to manage his financial affairs or his medical. So we did seek guardianship. The way the process works is you go through the courts, and they do a determination, and then you go to court, and you get your legal guardianship papers if they deem that you should have guardianship. They have to make the decisions really to protect. People are trying to get their guardianship, and they don't need guardianship. So we have guardianship, we have papers, and that gets us access to medical records, allows us to manage his finances, and all those things that we need to do. And you really need to think that through early, because once they turn 18, you're back up against the court. So we did that a little early, so by the time he was 18, we had all that paperwork in order. That's an important step to take, too.
How involved is it, Kathy?
Basically, they assign what's called a guardian ad litem to the person whose guardianship is being sought, and that guardian ad litem comes in. They did talk to Garrett about what guardianship meant. Garrett didn't get it at all. That was okay. And then they go and they talk to the schools and the doctors and relatives, just basically to make sure that you're not trying to take their rights away from them without cause. And then they write a report. And then the report basically says whether they think you should have the guardianship or not. And then you go to court and you go before a judge, and the guardian ad litem says whether they think you should have it or not. And then the judge grants it or not. Now, in our case, it was pretty simple because it was pretty obvious. You can also do partials, where you get partial guardianship of financial, not medical, and things like that. But for us, it was kind of straightforward, but it does take time because the report has to be written, and you have to get a court date and all those things, and it does cost money, too. It's not free to go get guardianship.
Is it very expensive?
It varies depending on where you live. For us, it was about $1,500.
What is the cost if you don't do this, Kathy?
You don't have access to information. You don't have access to medical records. You're not in a place that you can affect financial decisions for your person you have guardianship for. Some people, depending on the severity, power of attorney may be enough, but for Garrett it was not. We really needed to have full control.
Okay. Thank you so much for explaining that. That's something that we don't often talk about.
Yeah, that was something, was an education for us going through that process too, because we had never taught it before.
Right. Okay, so what's the most difficult lesson that you've learned when it comes to planning for Garrett's future?
I think what was really hard is to plan for kind of, I don't want to say worst case exactly, but you kind of have to plan for things not turning out just fine. And I'm kind of an optimistic person, and it was kind of hard for me to go, you know what? I still think everything's going to be fine, but I got to start planning that it's not going to be fine. And it felt almost like a betrayal to him, to say you're not going to be independent. But it's not. And I think it's just a matter of a focus for us, and that was really hard. So we changed our tune kind of early, though, and said, you know what, we got to do this because what if? Plans that you don't use can be abandoned, but plans that you don't make are a real problem. So,
right. Oh, I like that.
Having the plan, as it turned out, actually became a great stress reducer. So we still work to get as much as we can, but we know that we have things in place, which makes a big difference.
Right, right.
And focusing on fixing it can kind of, I think, lead to self-esteem issues in the kids, but also really poor planning. So I don't think you should abandon trying to fix it. We tend to talk around here about making the most of it versus fixing it.
Right, right. And you have it even more complicated due to his heart transplant.
Right. And I think people think of that as being negative, and I did at first too. And then I turned the corner and said, you know what, it's not negative. It's just realistic and good planning.
Mm-hmm. So can you be specific with some of the planning that you've done?
Yes. So I will say that it can be very expensive to plan for a special needs adult, and we are really blessed to be able to do it. So some things that are accessible to us may not be as accessible to others, but your state and county have things available that can help people. I mean, the first thing we did is we set up our wills with a special needs trust. So Garrett cannot have assets or he loses access to Medicaid and his disability income and things like that. So we set up a special needs trust with life insurance that when Dennis and I pass away, it's a joint survivorship policy. So if one of us dies, it doesn't pay. It's when both of us die. And it pays into his trust and basically sets up his financial future so that he can have money coming off of that to help pay for his life. So it's a special will, and it takes money, honestly, to get it set up. But I do believe that certain states have help with getting that set up. Then the other thing we did is when he turned 18, we did sign him up for disability income, and that was a tough decision for us. But we did it because it gets him access to Medicaid and does help defray the cost of some of the life insurance that we carry to cover his future. So it was like this very circular thing where most people have the ability to save for retirement more at our ages. We don't, because we've got this life insurance to cover. So we do use the disability income to help take care of his daily needs so that we have more money to save for retirement. So it was tough for us because we're not in a financial bad situation. We're not rich, but we kind of made a decision, you know what, we're going to do that. So we did apply for it. He does get a little money, and we do use that for his daily living so that we can pay for the other things we need to pay for. And it does get him access to the Medicaid as well. And then life insurance. Whole if you can do it, but not everybody can do whole. It's very expensive. We do not do entirely whole life because it's too expensive, but we do kind of a split. So it's kind of like you have the life insurance, which pays out when you pass into a trust so that they have the financial means to be taken care of, and then the SSDI to defray some of the costs so that you can afford what you need to do, right? Kind of circular, but that's what we do. And then Matthew, he has a younger brother who is 2 years younger who will be the executor of all of this. We talked to Matthew about it. He is 16 and a half, and he knows what these things are. He knows that they exist for his brother. He knows that that's going to be part of what he does, and he's a really good kid, and he's always kind of been fine with that. And we're very lucky that he's fine with that. And if he wasn't, we would find somebody else to do it. So we have educated him financially on all these vehicles, too. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but I think it's important that he understands.
That doesn't sound crazy. No, that doesn't sound crazy at all, Kathy. I think that just like you were saying, you have to plan well in advance. And you're obviously a very tight-knit family.
You know, the one thing I really worry about in the planning space still, though, is housing. I just don't think there's enough available for people like Garrett. And one of the things Dennis and I talk about is how do we settle him in a place that he's living. He won't be independently living. It'll be more like a heavily assisted living. But they don't really have that for young adults. So that's one of the places that we're still trying to figure out how does that work. So that I'm still looking at, but I'm looking at it now because this is not something we're going to need for a really long time, but I do need to start thinking about what it is. But it's everything. The planning is financial, it's family, understanding what it takes, it's everything.
It sounds very challenging, but it sounds like you and Dennis have handled this in a very level-headed manner and in a very proactive manner. And I think it's so important to be proactive. You don't want to be reactive when it comes to something like this. This takes a tremendous amount of planning.
Yes, and choices. I remember when we started facing that life insurance bill for Garrett, we stood outside and talked about two very rational people. We stood outside the office because it was a lot of money, and we were like, okay, the odds are, honestly, that Garrett will pass away before us. So we had a conversation, and what we decided is we're never going to bet against Garrett.
Yeah. Well, I love that because that's also a very strong emotional choice that you have made. This is a big issue, and when you're talking life and death, I mean, it doesn't get any bigger than that. Do you think, Kathy? Seriously?
No, it doesn't. And I remember that conversation happened many years ago, and I remember it vividly because we sat there and we made that decision that it's a lot of money every year, and odds are, you know, but at the same time, this is what we're going to bet. We're going to bet that it's going to work out. We're not going to put Garrett in a situation where we bet that it wasn't, and now we've got trouble. This goes back to that planning thing.
Right. So. And you just never know. Planning so that your son won't be left without help. I mean, that's very scary to me, thinking that my children might need some help and I didn't have the forethought to plan for it, and thus I crippled my children.
Right.
That's just,
well, that's it.
That's just not acceptable. Right. Wow.
But it does take a lot of time to research it and understand it, but it's well worth it to do.
So did you hire a financial planner to help you with this, or did you and Dennis figure this all out on your own?
Well, we eventually did. I don't know if you remember those Mass Mutual commercials on TV where that mom is taking care of her kid who was in the ICU, and they talk about special needs planning. Dennis and I watched that commercial, and it's like, well, my child was in the ICU for 60 days, and we're going, yeah, that's not very long, but okay. But we did go and talk to a special needs financial planner, which made a big difference. You have to find someone who knows these issues, and that helped a lot. So, I definitely recommend that.
That is all such fabulous information. And this is something that we don't talk about enough. So I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing this information with us, Kathy.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Like I said, I could have talked for a long time about all of this, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to people about it because I think it is important to know what it takes.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, that does conclude this episode of Heart to Heart with Anna. Thanks for listening today. Please find and like us on Facebook. Check out our website, hearttoheartwithanna.com, and our Cafe Press Boutique. Follow our radio show on Blog Talk Radio and Spreaker. And remember, my friends, you are not alone.
Thank you again for joining us this week. We hope you've been inspired and empowered to become an advocate for the congenital heart defect community. Heart to Heart with Anna, with your host Anna Jaworski, can be heard every Tuesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. We'll talk again next week.